So lian-li asked me if I wanted to check out their new Edge power supply. I was like, no. And then this came. And I was like, yeah. So this is the Edge 1300 watt platinum power supply. So you might look at the picture, so that's what caught my attention, was where they put the plugs. Because power supplies are boring. They're boring. Unless you have really neat equipment to hook up to it and truly test it and test the rail designs and test for ripple and all kinds of other things, which I don't, there's nothing to talk about. However, the arrangement of these cables might be what's interesting to talk about. So we're gonna open this up right now. I don't know why the box is shaped this way, unless they're just really kind of playing on the shape of the PSU, but it's more than just a power supply because this actually has a built-in USB hub as well. I think they've identified that is so weird. I think they've identified that many systems don't have like enough USB hookups in their motherboards anymore. So you can see right here, and it's a little dirty, whatever, been handling it. They've got USB device connection right here, and then a USB lead that you can go to your motherboard. Because many motherboards now only have one, maybe two of USB direct port or like connection headers. But as more devices are using those headers, they realized like, why not add a USB header to the freaking power supply? And for a second there, I thought our mesh was dented, but it's not. It's like polygonal, so it's kind of a neat looking design. Like I said, this is a 1300 watt power supply. Do you see how tiny this is? It's insanely small. But I'm a little curious about the orientation of installation for this, because it makes most sense. And if you look at the lian-li logo on here, the way it's designed to go, it really makes sense for like their O11 Dynamic series, because the power supplies are mounted vertical like that. So this gives you a place to plug the cables in, have them come directly out and go into their thing. But what if you're using a standard type of chassis? Like this is a lian-li 216 right here. So it uses a more conventional layout where it's horizontal on the bottom. So now if you mount it like this, with your cables pointing up, that could be nice, but now you need to think about the fact that your power supply is pulling air from inside the chassis instead of facing down, pulling it out of the bottom of the chassis like most people would install their power supply. I'm actually one of those weirdos that often will let it pull cold air from the chassis. But what I'm curious about now is how much room we have if we mount it facing down like this, where the cables would now have to make a loop to go a direction. So it's kind of like a trade-off here, where it's definitely optimized for vertical mount like this, and potentially having the fan face upward. Let's take a look at the cables here real quick. I just can't get over how small a 1300 watt power supply is nowadays, especially considering the fact that it is a platinum rated PSU with Japanese capacitors. Okay, so we've got 4 stainless steel screws, 4 white zip ties or clear zip ties, and then here's our cables, which are all contained in this bag. And the reason why I have the case out is I'm gonna install it in this case because I wanna see what it's like in those different orientations. I'm wondering if this makes it easier to get to the cables to plug in once the power supply is installed. Because if you ever had that in there and then you're trying to plug your stuff in and you can't quite see it, I don't know if this would necessarily be easier by making it flatter, but I'm just curious. Anyways, you can see we have our white cables here. It is a PCIe 5.1. So there's already been a revision to PCIe 5.0. It's now 5.1, which makes this obviously an ATX 3.0. Or potentially a 3.1. I don't know if that carries over that way. So we do have a plastic type sleeve on here. It's not a paracord, which is nice because that means it's gonna be less likely to pick up any sort of transfer from rubber grommets and stuff as you push your cables through. It does have integrated combs on here, big, thick integrated combs, which are nice to see because often combs that are too tiny, when you go to like cable manage and you push on those, they can break. But these don't feel like they're gonna break at all. They are thick. And those same combs are gonna exist here, obviously, on our PCI, is this PCI Express? Yes, this is PCIe, which is a single PCIe, which is nice, because then if you have a card that uses 1, 2, or 3, you can have individual PCIes going rather than pigtails. Yeah, so it's got the same sleeve on there, it's got the same comb. We got 1, 2, probably 3. Yep, we've got 3 dedicated PCI Express cables. So this is awesome if you're running an older series graphics card that needs up to 3 for high power, like 3080s, 3080 Ti's, like 3090s custom PCBs. This is a PSU to CPU. We've got 2 of these. And then this is kind of awesome. So I want to show this. Oh, here's another one. It's another PCI Express. We have 4 dedicated single PCI Express, 2 CPUs. Here is one of our SATAs right here. So this is a more traditional type of SATA, which has just kind of a sort of a gap along the way. Looks like we got about 6 inches of gap between each plug. What I wish is that the one on the end though was a 180 instead of a 90 like that, because that makes it easier if you're just using it to plug in like controller or something. When it's straight, sometimes I find it a little bit more effective that way, especially if you have flat mounted SSDs on the back of the motherboard. It's easier to plug it straight up into that rather than having to like do this with the cable to get it to go in there, right? That's a big bend on the cable. So having a straight one on that would be nice. We've got one of those. Here's a second one of those. Here is our Molex. We've got 2. Here's another SATA. So we got 3 of those SATAs. Okay, so apparently they heard me because this one has 2 of those. So it's 2 pigtails with a 2. Okay, so ignore what I just said. They already thought of it. So there you go. We've got, and they're separate too. So you've got 2 SATAs coming off of one header right there, which is really nice. But check this out. And our Molex, which is needed every now and then. We have our PCIe 12 volt high power here, which is sleeved. Geez, this is thick too, by the way. I want to point this out. Like, this is some actual thick cable here. Hopefully this will help for things to come. It's got like this nice light blue color on there, which is nice because, again, having any sort of a color difference on there is nice to see because of the fact that it allows you to tell if your cable's starting to come loose. It's kind of like the earlier cables people came out with that were yellow, so it was real obvious, but because we have a white cable here, this blue color allows you to see if things are starting to loosen up. Obviously, since it's a 1300 watt power supply, we've got 600 watts available to it, and we have 2 of those because some graphics cards apparently now, I don't know if you're gonna have 2 ever, but we have 2 available to it because of the wattage. So this is nice too if you're running some sort of a workstation or something where maybe you're running more than one 40 series card for rendering purposes or whatever, you can have 2 dedicated powers that are 600 watts each. You're not gonna obviously be able to load those up to 600 watts at the same time for 1200 watts of total power on a 1300 watt power supply, but graphics cards rarely ever get up that high anyway, especially for it doing rendering and stuff. It won't be as much load as like games unless you are doing very specific type of tasks. But this is awesome. They give you one of these, which is the perfect separate height for most drive cages. So if you're running 2.5-inch drives or maybe 3.5-inch drives that are like spinning drives, you can have 4 of them just immediately, like you don't have to deal with the pigtail trying to tuck it in and stuff and then breaking the connector because the plastic's always soft on the drive so they snap. This allows you to be able to run 4 drives in a drive cage just right in there. They only give you 1 of these. It'd be nice to have 2, but that's awesome to see right there. And then we have 2 options for our power supply hub. This right here is just a standard motherboard header to motherboard header, which as you can see goes in the back of the power supply, right there like that. Let's say for instance, you don't have a header at all. Let's say it's happened. I actually had a motherboard a while back. I can't remember which one it was. It did not have any USB 2 headers at all. It had multiple USB 3s and it came with a USB 3 to USB 2 adapter if I needed it. So they give you a USB motherboard header to USB-A that you can plug in on the back side of your motherboard, which is now why I understand we have this I/O port, which gives you a gap to run that cable through. This might be one of the most inclusive power supplies I've ever experienced. All right, let's do this. Let's go ahead and get the back of the case open. Let's get the power supply sort of situated so we can see how the orientations are and if it's any easier to work on this way in a case that is not a vertical mount. So here's just an example of why this type of plug is awesome, because if I had 1 and 2 drives right there, I could technically just have those be like, boop, right into the power. And then the one I'm not using just fits in between the drive cages right there, look at that. So that's awesome to see. You talk about tidiness. Okay, so obviously this power supply, like I said, is designed for dual chambers, chambered cases like the 011. So if you put this in standard height or standard direction like this, it would be fine in this case. This LANCool 216, which is also a lian-li case, because if I turn it around, you can see we have ventilation right here. So it can pull air through this chassis, and these 2 front intake fans right now, these big fans in the front, I think they're 160 millimeter, I believe. It could be 140s, it might be 160s, I can't remember. Anyway, they're bigger than 120s. They're pushing so much air into the front of this, there'd be no problem for having some of it make its way down into the lower compartment. Plus, I'm not using any exhaust on the top of this chassis, so airflow is front to rear no matter what. And some going down there isn't gonna be a problem whatsoever. And then if I take a look at the way that the cables are situated, I mean, they could potentially be easier that way, but I still think it would make most sense to have the cables installed first and then put the power supply in, only because getting to the back ones would be difficult. Now this case does have a mid plate that is removable. There are screws here and there that I could take these off. I could even mount fans to these if I wanted. So I could have a fan pushing down onto the power supply if I wanted. And then I could plug them in through here and have my hand reach through there, but not all cases can do that. But fortunately, because it's a lian-li case and a lian-li power supply, it's almost like it's got compatibility even with the 216, which is one of our favorite sub $100 cases. So now I wanna see now, because now you can imagine if this was an 011 like that, right? It'd be like up here. That would be just so easy. Actually, it cuts down on the cable run significantly to the point to where you'd probably have to still zip tie up and bundle them quite a bit because you're gonna have excess now. My only concern a little bit is that with these cables right here, USB devices, like plugs, are pretty flexible. I would just wanna make sure that they're not interfering with each other. So they'd be difficult to plug one in, I think after, oops, it's upside down. I think after the power plugs are in, it might be difficult to get to those. But as you can see, you can bend them out of the way, but they still get pretty close. But fortunately, there's enough of a gap there to be able to plug in a USB cable as well as having the PCI Express there. Now, because the PCI Express are all in a straight line right there, let's say you did have some interference for some odd reason, you have a very stiff USB cable or something, you can just use one over here out of the way, right? And that won't be a problem. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna get all these cables that I need for this very basic system plugged in, so that I can see whether or not this makes life any easier. So I plugged in 24 pin, I plugged in 24 pin, one PCI Express, because the 4060 Ti in there just uses one, two CPU EPS power, and one SATA, because of the fact that I just have this controller right here that needs to be plugged in. What I want to point out is I'm not gonna be plugging in the 12 volt high power because this graphics card is not using it, but one of the cables is a 12 volt high power on both ends, and the other one is actually a conversion cable that goes from two PCI Express to a single 600. So it's kind of curious that they chose not to put two 12 volt high powers on the power supply when other power supply brands that are running two have two dedicated ones, but I just want to point that out. I almost feel like they added this one later, which is fine. I mean, power is power. I think we all would prefer to still have PCI Express on both ends rather than 6+2 rather than a 12 volt. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and just now, I think this is actually gonna make things a little bit easier because look at this. It actually makes it feel like I have a little bit more cable length available to me too. That does actually look cleaner as well, like this. There's not a whole lot of different ways to reinvent the wheel when it comes to power supplies, especially when we're dealing with a standard. You know, they're all gonna be a rectangular cube like this. They're all gonna have plugs on the end of it. But how do you make it start to make sense in terms of giving you extra features and stuff? Well, the USB hub built into this, it's the first time I've personally had one that has a USB hub built in. I'm trying to think of anything else that they could, like, build more hubs in there. Maybe do an ARGB hub. That'd be nice, because we all know a lot of motherboards now don't provide enough ARGB. Make it have a hub built into it for RGB, maybe even adding a fan hub or something on there. I mean, they're getting smaller, which means we have more room to do stuff like this. Imagine if your power supply in the dual chamber turned sideways had a row of ARGB. It had a row of fan headers. It had a row of, obviously it's got its USB, and then all you need is one wire going to it to give you a lead, or a signal, so either RGB or fan, PWM or whatever. I think that would be something people would be all kinds of into. So it actually creates a lot more space down here, because normally you would have the power supply with the cables coming out that way, which would take up all of this section right here. And this is why I normally remove drive cages when I'm not using drives, just to have more room for the cables. But because of the direction that they're going now, they're facing the direction they're gonna go naturally. Everything's actually working out pretty well. And I wanna point this out. If I were to flip this power supply over and have the fan on the bottom, I don't think we would actually have as nice of a cable run, if you will, because the EPS is actually a little bit shorter than the other power supply had. And I was able to run the other cable up over here through the channel and back over, but I can't do that even though I have these as far towards the outside of the case as I can go. But I still would be perfectly fine with running the fan this way in this case because it's getting fresh air. Now again, like I said, if I flipped it over, the motherboard 24-pin cable would then be on the opposite side, which means it'd be as far inside as possible, which means now I probably wouldn't be able to run through the straps this way. I'd have to probably come straight across like that to make the clearance, or I have enough length in the cables. So it's obvious that this is truly designed for a dual channel type of case. That's pretty no-brainer. But even in a standard like layout like this, you can see it's working pretty well. Now, if we were to use an even bigger chassis, this is a mid-tower, the 216, then we might end up starting to run into some cable length issues, specifically with the EPS. Now, because of the fact in the lian-li 011, this is like much higher set in the chassis, that's not a problem. So that's something you need to consider if you're looking at getting a case or a power supply like this with this type of plug layout in a larger chassis than something mid-tower. Like I said, no point in even showing it in an 011, I don't personally believe, because it's just gonna make perfect sense being mounted right here. But I wanted to really see how this thing laid out inside of a standard chassis. Now, obviously, if we had our USB cables and stuff coming out, there's plenty of room. I mean, I can get 3 fingers in there pretty easily. And then we still have all this space right here for clearance. And then the side panel would obviously fit on there just fine. There, no issues whatsoever. All right, there you go, guys. That's the Edge PSU from lian-li. And you're gonna be able to see it through here because it's white. It looks kind of neat in there with the cables coming up. It's like the power supply is almost the neatest, like, you can see how tidy it is, there's no doubt about it. I think we just need lian-li to make longer cables or have a longer cable option. That's sick looking. All right, guys, you can see now on the front side with all the cable runs, though, there's no real excess sitting inside the main compartment of the case. So that's why I was saying, if I flipped it the other way, the 24 pin would definitely have to be routed a little different because of the fact that it probably would not reach. It's also nice to have the cable combs included. It's like getting a custom cable set, only it comes with your power supply, and then you get this nice trained cable look like that. And not to mention, this has to make a longer run than most PSUs would because of the fact that this is just a 4060 Ti, so the PCB stops right where that plug is. Big GPUs, the plug would be like back here somewhere. So that would be a more straight run, but we still had plenty of length to do it. So how do you guys feel about this? I know power supplies are a boring subject, but are you guys at least happy that manufacturers and brands are starting to kind of think outside the standard cube with cables coming out the back and adding things like a USB hub? What else do you think brands should incorporate in a power supply to make it more utilitarian than just providing power to your system? The USB hub was an amazing touch. I still think we should get fan hubs and RGB hubs in there as well. All right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you in the next one.